Higan, so our topic for the benefit of our YouTube viewers, Higan, Obon is in usually late summer and is a yearly service. Higan is celebrated twice a year, spring and autumn, at the equinox. So it's spring equinox and autumn equinox. So the explanation I'm going to give tonight, or overview, I should say overview, is not meant to be like a complete analysis and the dispositive, once you hear this, you know everything there is to know about Higan. It's more, I can't say it's a celebration, it's more, we'll say, an observation, right? So it's an observance in the temple. And the reason I decided to do this, we did the same one last week in Honolulu, same class. The reason I decided to do this, when I first started at the temple, we had gone through the summer. I started in the spring, we went through the summer and got to Obon, and I attended Obon. So I thought, okay, this makes sense. I see people are praying for the deceased, and it was a bigger celebration. And then we had another service the following month, and it's Autumn Higan, and I thought, seems like it's the same thing we just did at Obon. And I didn't understand, there was no explanation given. So it was one of those, this is what we always do, and so we're going to do it. And I thought, okay, so people had registered the names to be read at the service, just in advance of the service, and that was it. But the service itself didn't look that much different from the others. So it was a bit perplexing, but I didn't want to, you don't really raise your hand in the middle like, what are we doing? What is this about? So I did a little bit of research. And like any observance service, this is East Asian Buddhism. So you've got Asian culture built into this. And in my mind, from a scholarly standpoint, Japanese Buddhism is often referred to as funeral Buddhism, or sometimes criticized as funeral Buddhism. I think there's another way to look at that, which is it's skillfully responding to the needs of the people. So it's filling a need that the people have that's unique to them. And in these days we think, well, Buddhism is meditation, right? All you need to do is meditate. And I think that was not in the consciousness of the people. So because Buddhism came to multiple lands where they already had a belief system, they already had services that they were doing, they already had spiritual concerns. And I think what you see now, 2,000 years later, are reinterpretations of the needs of the people, but those initial needs aren't that different. And I think if we look at our native, spiritual systems, whether they be, actual Aboriginal, Native American belief systems, or early Christianity in the United States, you'll see a response to what people are interested in. And I think you'll see that with prosperity gospel, right? People are interested in making money. How do we justify capitalism? Because we kind of like that. And so the theology changes. So that was kind of my goal, to give some background, not to try to explain every single thing that there could be to understand about Higan, but more from a Western perspective. When we see this service happening, what's going on? Why are we doing this? Especially, I think the initial thought that I had, why are we doing this, what looks to be the same thing that we just did at Obon? So the first thing to kind of mention is this is the autumn equinox, which will be September 23rd of this year. And for the benefit of the recording, today is the 13th of September. So we'll give the explanation a little bit in advance. The idea goes back to the Chinese calendar and observing the world from the calendar system. So the autumn and spring equinoxes become very important for the balance of yin and yang and those balancing forces. So you can see it very much from the lens of the balance of light and dark, the balance or connection between this world and the other world. There's a lot of background, so I'm going to try to go through some of that. So I'm going to go start from Japan, then kind of work our way back to China, and then the introduction of Buddhism, and so kind of all these things mixed together, because we have a lot of chop suey happening in terms of ideas for how the service comes to be. I should have brought it out, but one of the sources for this is going to be the Kojiki, the record of ancient matters. So this is one of the more ancient books in Japan. So the Kojiki has a lot of the origin stories, mythology of Shinto, as well as very, very early history of Japan. There is an English translation or translations. Some of them are written kind of as was popular, I think, in the 1800s, early 1900s, to render translations of ancient books to make them sound like the Bible, especially the King James Version, which isn't helpful when you're trying to read them. So rather than read the translation of the Kojiki that I have in English, which is kind of the standard one that you'll see in colleges, I'm going to just tell the story that's in there. So that's in terms of the source where some of this is going to come from. Then we have the actual word Higan, which means the other shore, which is juxtaposed with Shigan, which is this shore, right? Our world. So our world of enduring suffering and hardships and things like that, and then the other shore being enlightenment. So from a strict Buddhist sense, when we say other shore, we mean the world of enlightenment, the enlightened mind. And this is very similar to the Christian idea of, what happens when you die. That answer really isn't in the Bible, but if you ask people, they go, well, you go to the pearly gates and you meet St. Peter. Well, that's kind of a popular mythology that grew up within Christianity, and nobody questions it. That's just what happens, right? And no one goes, well, what? And of course, there's probably just as many stories about that as there are bar jokes that include, you get to the gate and you meet St. Peter. So there's a lot of those ideas coming in. And so then there's another concept called the Sanzu no Kawa, the river of three crossings. And I'll explain that later on, but it's an idea that came in from China as what happens when you die, and the idea that you're crossing the river Styx, basically. So most likely you had some additional influx of religious ideas that came with the Silk Road that get mixed into folk knowledge. And so I always have to try to remind people, if someone will say, well, this is Buddhism, and I read this or that sutra. It's great that you read the sutra. Go back 120 years, no one can read. No one's literate. Very few people are literate. And go back even farther, this type of direct knowledge and study of the Dharma was not possible for the average person. First, how long did you live? Right, 45 was old. And were you literate? Did you even have access to the books? Did you have them? So we know, so I'm sitting closer to Kukai now. Part of his story leaving China was, hand copying books, because you couldn't just go to the bookstore and buy a copy. You couldn't read the PDF online, and getting a copy of a book meant, physically sitting down and making a copy yourself. So, this was very kind of precious knowledge. So, what people popularly believed about death and dying and life was, very much dependent and focused on what they heard. So you had a lot more folk tales. I would say this is also very similar to people's ideas of death in Christianity. How much of it is something they heard at church, and how much of it is actually Dante's Inferno, right? So if you read Dante's Inferno, there's actually a lot of the ideas from this novel that people think is actual scriptural basis. So, how many times do we study or hear about the various rings of hell, and people just assume that's a thing, and they don't realize where it's coming from. Or even more ancient ideas of death and dying that are coming from Norse mythology, that are coming from, and sorry to the Norse gods for referring to you as mythology, but they're coming from Norse beliefs or coming from ancient Irish, Scottish, or Druidic type belief systems that are mixed in. Where does the Christmas tree come from? Where did the Yule log come from? Where is the horn of plenty? So we have this mix of culture in our culture as well, and people just take it for granted and don't question it. Then we walk into a Buddhist temple and we're like, well, what is all this stuff? How dare they have this when all I want to do is meditate? So of course you're going to have more than just the meditation cushion. Okay, so we'll go back to Higan. So celebrated March and September, and that would be March and September of the solar calendar, which really would be in the lunar calendar, the old October. So the shift is a little bit different. The idea is that the patterns of yin and yang, where you're looking at the calendar, are more in balance, and then in the old Chinese belief systems, I have the books around here. You actually see, the gods changing stations or changing positions during these times, both literally, in the court of the Jade Emperor, but also, what gods are ruling the month, the hour, and this kind of thing. So, I guess it's worth noting. Again, this is East Asian Buddhism. So, when you're in China, Vietnam, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, I don't want to leave anybody out, but there's an underlying foundation of yin yang theory, which we might today call Taoism, which was just the way things were at the time. Confucian ideas. So this is just the fabric of society. So the ideas are built on, transmitted through, explained through this lens. Not necessarily that we're taking in all these Taoist ideas. They weren't really. Sometimes I think it's a disservice to Chinese culture and Taoism to call certain ideas Taoist. It's just that's the way the Chinese mind conceptualizes things. So it's very similar to, the influence that Greek philosophy has had on Western culture, even down to university systems and how we learn in school and how I learned, the Socratic method in law school. Right? You have all these things that are just givens that are passed down to us through thousands of years of history and are woven in to our ideas, and we don't think of it as being, well, I'm X religion and therefore I shouldn't have this Greek philosophical concept intruding on my... No, but when we are new, again, you walk into the temple like I did, I'm like, why are we doing this now? How is that connecting to, well, I read the Lotus Sutra and I don't see this. So it helps, I think, to have a little bit of background. So let's get to the story, and I'll stop philosophizing so much because the story is a lot more fun. So Higan is about fundamentally, praying for the deceased, and it helps to know what people thought of death. How do people think of death, and what do they think happened when you died? So when you read the Kojiki early on, you have this origin story for Japan. So you have the goddess, first you have Izanami and Izanagi creating Japan, the islands of Japan, stirring the oceans with the spear and the islands coming up. And then you have birth of other gods. So later on in that story, it says, after giving birth to the fire deity, the goddess Izanomi no Mikoto died and was buried at Mount Hiba. Her husband, Izanaki no Mikoto, was not satisfied, however, and desiring to see her, went to the land of Yomi. So this is where the ideas about the death begin. So you have this goddess die. Her husband, another god, wants to see her. It's natural. What happened? Right? This is the first time we've ever encountered death. So I like to read these stories through the lens of sort of human psychology. Who is the first person in our lives to die? And of course we naturally ask, what has happened to them? Are they still there in a different way? Right? There's this unknown. So, wanting to see his wife, he decides to go to the land of Yomi. So it's usually translated as underworld, but actually in the Kojiki it doesn't say that it's below, right? We contemplate hell as like underground somehow, but I think more the idea that it's distant. So there is a place in Japan where this place is actually marked by huge boundaries, and there's a Shinto shrine there, and there's no cave going down. There's actually a mountain, but you feel different when you walk into the mountain. Kind of like Oregon, when you go on a hike, you leave the trailhead and then the temperature changes, the moss is different. You are transported to a different world. So this does get into some of the ideas that the Japanese had about death. They would take the deceased and leave them in caves or into the mountains. And so the mountains were a place you didn't go in ancient Japan. And Buddhism really changed that. Mountains became places of practice for monks, but that also gave, what we'll say, monks or professional spiritual cultivators an otherworldly quality. Like they dare to tread, these mountains. So mountains already had special spiritual significance in China. Of course, they had also in Japan as places where the gods resided, also just like Mount Olympus, right? So I think human consciousness has always ascribed, mountaintops to something otherworldly. So even more so later on in Japan, the great monastic complexes are on mountaintops, right? They're in a different world. Also very good place to avoid earthquakes, typhoons, famine. You've got mountain vegetables, and just a smart place to go. And war. Hide up in the mountain. So here's, the god wanting to know what happened. So it says he takes a comb from his hair, breaks off one of the teeth of the comb, and lights that as a candle, and then goes into the land of Yomi, because he needs light. So it's a dark place. And then he sees his wife dead, and the body's decaying, and it's not a good sight. And he's kind of horrified, and he actually sees other gods being born from her corpse. So like the god of thunder and these other gods being born. So being horrified, he flees, comes back to the land of life and light, and feels that he has soiled himself by going to this land, and has to do the misogi. So he finds a river and cleanses himself. So that story says that he washes his face, and from different parts of his face other gods are born, and then he washes his body and other gods are born from that contact with the other world. The interesting thing is the later gods that are born from his body are actually symbolic of the hardships that we suffer in this world, which I find fascinating because, no matter what your religious faith, at some point there's some tragedy and somebody says, why do you let this happen? Why is there suffering? And I think it kind of implies that the created world of the gods was initially a pure place, but these hardships are brought back from the land of suffering. But also, interestingly, right, his desiring to know what happened after death brings this hardships back, which in a way kind of mirrors this, not eating from the fruit of knowledge, and eating the apple creates your suffering and your sin. So I find the parallels very interesting. And the reason that's important, why is that important? We're in a Buddhist temple. Why are we talking about Shinto? It's important because these are like basic human needs and emotions, and people die, we're sad. When people die, we want to know what happened. When people die, we're not sure if we're going to see them again. So all these things come up. And so if we had the opportunity, wouldn't all of us travel to the land of Yomi to see our loved one. So this is the beginning point of this idea of an afterworld, right? Or underworld. I don't want to say under, it's not exactly under, but an afterlife, a world where there's more, something else. And it implies that a journey is required. There's a crossing of something to get there. You can't just turn the corner. You have to go someplace. So you see a lot of symbolic language, and probably from that, likely, depending on how the Kojiki was written, either people read this and decided that's a good way to bury people, or the mythology arises up around the practices of the people already. That part I don't think matters. I think it's more interesting to just look at it as an expression of, right, the human consciousness. So mountains become this sort of interstitial place between worlds, which is why to this day Koyasan is considered like a pure land in and of itself, and why it's this huge cemetery. Right? So people want it to be buried, as was the ancient custom, in the mountains, but to be as close to Kobayashi as possible, and to await the return. So you see this mixing of Buddhist ideas and natural native ideas. Because if you go back in Buddhist history, of course, you'd be cremated in the banks of the Ganges, and kind of the Hindu idea, and spread, or cremated and urge would be kept, as was the case with the Buddha. So there's this mixing of ideas. So there's sort of a question, okay, why are there different worlds? And I think from our experience, these are the big unanswered questions. So this is how the 10 stages of mind starts out. Kobayashi says, human beings, living beings don't know where they're from, they don't know where they're going. Right? This is the big mystery. And so through the development of wisdom, we get some level of understanding of that. But that's available to those of us with time. And Higan was really focused in many ways on people who didn't have so much time, right? Lifespan was shorter. We have the beauty of electric light right now, but if this was actually we're living on a farm, maybe lights out, we've got to just wake up with the sun, and there's not time to sit around and definitely not study books. But even more so, what were you likely to hear around the campfire? Probably not, well, young people, I spent 5 years in the monastery, they're going to hear, folk tales. They're going to hear, and that becomes very much embedded in the consciousness of the people as to what death means. So you can actually go now, there's a shrine in Japan that's allegedly the site of the entrance to the land of Yomi. There's a shrine that says, this is where the god returned and did this misogi, this purification, and cleansed himself in the actual river. You can actually look up, what gods were born. What I find is they're referred to as the 80 myriads of disorders. So the pollution produced from this, having gone to the land of suffering, this land of Yomi, created these gods of disorder. So that's how disorder came to our world. So that part I find just very interesting, because somewhere in our mythology we have answered the question somehow. Right? Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, is that part of why in Shinto having things be so pure for the gods is so important? Because
so important.
This is
it starts off right away, like this cleanliness, this cleaning. So that's why they do in Shinto, there are offerings of fish, but they clean it completely, so you just have it's usually sea bream. So the fish, but it's gutted and clean, so it's just the flesh, which is very white, and then salt, sake, water, all very, rice, obviously, very pure, basic, initial ingredients. Not a lot of cooked food or, that kind of thing. So you will see a fish periodically, but usually just water, sake, rice, these kind of things, paper. Everything's very clean, very simple in this way. But yes, that's why the primary practice is purification. So even the prayers in Shinto are all, purification, purification, purify me. And that's actually how you, of course, get closer to the gods. It does, unfortunately, sometimes result in some sexism. So for a lot of times, women aren't allowed to enter shrine grounds or whatever during menstruation. And I have actually seen sometimes that gets pulled over into Buddhist thinking of sometimes at temples, and it's a cultural thing, not a Buddhist thing, but where people say, well, you can't offer the flowers or you can't do this or that because, you're a younger woman, so that the presence of the blood is making you impure. So that's not a Buddhist idea or concept, but it's, deeply ingrained in Japanese thinking. When I first encountered that, I was like, so I had to think through, like, oh, maybe that's why. I was like, oh, that's very interesting. Just how, again, culture is always stronger than religion. There's another kind of layer to this, right? So you see the goddess die, and then God's being born from her body. So there's this, intrinsic concept of like, in order for there to be new life, there has to be death. There's a cycle. So I think it's beautiful in a way that you can see a lot of different ideas and layers. So anyway, that's the initial kind of origin story for the ideas of death in Shinto. So, because Higan is uniquely a Japanese observance. So now you get another layer. So you get this layer from China coming over probably in the 900s up to 1100s. The idea that the deceased crosses a river. And with this idea, you can already see some kind of low-level Buddhist influence on the story. So the river is the Sanzu no Kawa, the river of three crossings. So it's the idea that the river is crossed by the deceased on the 7th day after their death. And that depending on your conduct during life, you would cross one of three ways. So if you had led a very virtuous and good life, you would cross a bridge. If your karma was fair to middling, you would cross a ford, right? So probably logs lashed together, and there were two demons that would make the crossing with you, but they would snatch the clothes from you, and then hang your clothes up in the branch of a tree to weigh your offenses, like how weighty are your offenses. So you'll actually see this in artwork where the deceased is nude on the bank of the shore, and there's a demon, and it's like looking afraid. And so this really gets in people's minds that this time of death is one of challenge and judgment. And so this is actually where a lot of the folk lore around memorial service came in. Why would you want to do the 7-day service, especially the first 7 day, is to intercede on behalf of the deceased when they're getting ready to make this crossing. And then later you get the idea that the deceased is actually being judged every 7 days. And so your memorial service or your offerings are like bribes to the judge so that they are judged more compassionately. None of this is actually Buddhist, but again, you can't remove it from people's consciousness. It would be like going to Christian church and saying, well, actually, the Christmas tree, right. People are going to say, get out of here, we're still keeping our Christmas trees. So you have this idea. And then if karma wasn't so good, then you'd have to try to cross the river without, canoe or anything. And it was infested with serpents and nasty critters. It would be very unpleasant. So you have this Sanzu no Kawa. So sometimes at a funeral, you will still see people putting coins in the pockets of the body, the clothes of the deceased, to pay the river ferry, right? Pay the fare. So, sometimes these ideas are still, very strongly kept. I was surprised, right? So I had read about this in college, and, I've seen it in modern times, in my lifetime. So I thought, oh, well, that's a pretty long-standing, these ideas persist, so we still have them. But also, I think, again, it reflects this uncertainty about death and what happens to the deceased.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So, this is in the context especially of Japanese Buddhist needs, right? Is there tradition in Buddhism itself, though, outside of that context or outside of the East Asian context, of offering merit to the dead?
Oh, yes. And that actually is, I guess you could say, scriptural. So that actually goes back to the source of Obon. And,
Okay.
Why do we do this? And so sometimes that story is considered apocryphal. There's a couple, I guess I would have a couple responses to that. Practice is probably the most practiced thing in Buddhism, and without that, we wouldn't have Buddhism today. You might have a couple temples with a couple recluses on mountains, but it wouldn't be what it is today. If you go to any large Buddhist complex, modern, even built recently, a huge part of that complex is going to be a memorial hall of some sort. So it's still an ongoing need for people. But you did see it at the time, of the Buddha. They said, what do you want us to do with your body? You cremate me, and then he takes his robe and bowl and says, create this memorial shape. So if there was no benefit to maintaining or keeping the relics and things like that, I think the Buddha would have said, go up in the forest, dig a pit, throw my body in there. There's no point. But he didn't say that. Those weren't the instructions given. So, venerating the relics of the Buddha has been done since, the day after the Buddha died. So that's not new. Now, I guess the question then would be, was that idea just so already deeply ingrained in Asian thinking that it couldn't be avoided? So that we probably need an anthropologist to help answer.
Yeah.
But to this day, the Buddha's relics continue to exist. There are major temples built for them. They are the focus of a lot of practice. So that's hard to say. So you get to a point where it's difficult to separate, very, very long-standing practices and then, right? So is it like 100% necessary to do it? No, not exactly. However, we have to make peace with death. And no meditator can truly meditate without contemplating death. And if you're not, you're deluding yourself. And it's going to come up one day and it's going to destroy your practice. So how do you deal with it? Because nobody's born that's just like, oh, death, yes, anytime I'm ready, no problem. It doesn't bother me whatsoever. No. I can't say that, doing a lot of funerals, memorial services, you see it differently. You definitely see it differently. I don't mind spending a lot of time in mortuaries and cemeteries, and reading and, thinking about people's lives, and then it makes you think about how do you want to live and what's really, it really puts things in perspective. And so just this weekend was at a mortuary, and we're at the columbarium and looking at all the urns, and You look at these and you go, okay, that guy's a big sports fan because his urn is decorated with sports memorabilia. That guy's a Mets fan. That was his life. That guy was a golf championship. Oh, that's a doctor and PhD. Look at all the initials after him. And then you've got that guy was probably a mechanic. And you know what? You're all right there together. So to some degree, is it our how important are our achievements? We as human beings, no matter what, we have these experiences in common, right? So that, I think, from a Buddhist standpoint, is a source of building a lot of compassion. We're all going to have parents. We're all going to, in the natural order of things, lose them. Sometimes the children go first, but normally the parents go first, and we see them grow older, and so you have this progression, and we have to respond to that somehow, if not only for our own sanity. So I think a lot of the ills in our society today is, more and more people are able to escape the basics of life and death. Everything just becomes, stay young forever, be glamorous. What NPR was talking about plastic surgery in Afghanistan and how prevalent it is. And we would think from our perspective, like, is there time in life in Afghanistan to have plastic surgery that's that big of a thing? And it is. And sometimes the world around you can be so chaotic that you want to escape inwardly, but not inwardly in a spiritual manner, but inwardly let me escape literally into the flesh. Which of course Buddhism would say it's not going to last, no matter what you do. And then where are you when you've done every surgery you can do to look and stay young, and then you realize this is still not enough. So I think that builds up, and there's a huge crash, right? And I think that you see that with a lot of young people. They don't want to grow old, right? There's a fear, and so they burn out and leads to suicidal thinking and this kind of thing. So I think it's much better I look forward to being, a 90-year-old man and telling people like, oh, I remember when. I find myself doing that now already. I don't think I'm that old yet, but but I already have this. I had that conversation with somebody today. They were talking about features of a car. It'll stay in the lane and it keeps its distance. And I said, I don't think I want a car. I don't think I need a car to do that much thinking for me. Somehow I saw everybody that, being from Detroit, lived lives, had cars. It was the Motor City, and their cars didn't think for them, and it was okay. So I don't know if I need all that. Right? So, at any rate, right? So I think we can. Why is it still relevant? I think it's still relevant because we do a lot of this escapism through all of our technological advancement, and we forget that will never solve the basic facts of living. So we still need to confront it and think about it. Right?
Yeah, and so to my question, there is, there clearly within Buddhist doctrine, there's this idea that the consciousness, something continues to be reborn.
Yes.
And clearly within many sutras, it talks about the qualities that could be merit. We dedicate merit at the end of every service.
Yes.
So this is a cultural practice is completely, actually, even though it's
completely focused
East
on
Asian, it's completely in alignment with.
Oh, absolutely.
Still with the practice. Of
absolutely. So really, this is upaya. This is a skillful means of this is what the people are doing. This is their biggest concern. So let's align the practices with that. And so, you have a culture where that is heavily focused on ancestor worship and concerns about death, and so that becomes the major focus. So, of course, in this country, everyone is on an individualistic spiritual path, so people just want to meditate for their personal benefit. So that will need to be skillfully turned towards how do we actually help others. Because Higan, Obon, everybody comes together. They mourn together. And then they support each other, right? And then they recognize, oh, yeah, that's my classmate. Or that was the guy that lived at the end of the road in my village. And I had a quarrel with him once. But he's in line with me just to offer incense too. So maybe I should go pray for his deceased father or see how he's doing. So it brings people together. My concern with the solo meditation only is it's too easy to just get up and walk out at the end of the session, and there's no connection with our combined practice and community. So it becomes very different. So I think that's why, if you say Buddhist temple, on the whole, when you go in that door, it's 95% Asian. And when you say meditation center, it's 95% Caucasian. So I think it's a very different perspective. So somehow we need to link those things back. But yes, we do have, very clear scriptural foundations for dedicating merit to the deceased. Yeah.
I'd be curious over time, part of American Buddhism is a shift away from other traditional forms of religion and spirituality. People are moving away from Christianity or Judaism or Islam or whole world Abrahamic religions, right? And part of that is cleansing them of the folklore and the traditions that came with it too. I'd be curious if over time, with the practice of upaya and the practice of this as wisdom, if people wouldn't rediscover new ways of dedicating merit and honoring those traditions for the dead.
I would hope so. I think that it's something that we really need. Actually, when I was coming up with the outline for this talk, I thought, where do we see it now? I think when a celebrity dies or commits suicide, then people suddenly are able to talk about death for a moment. Example, Kate Spade. So Kate Spade dies, known for her handbags. So I happened to be walking past one of the stores. So I went in because I was very curious. My hope was the store would have some sort of memorial named after the founder. The founder dies. They should recognize that, even though the store is focused on commerce. And I looked around and I was very disappointed that I didn't see anything, right? There was no portrait, there's no flower from the portrait. I looked around. So I thought, that's too bad, right? I was thinking maybe capitalism would give way to something here for a moment. And just as I was getting ready to leave, I looked at the front counter and they had a statement at the counter saying, a percentage of profits would be donated to suicide prevention in honor of this. And I thought, oh, good, right? They did do something. Because I was, thinking, it's not too often these days you walk through a store where the store's named for the actual person and, that person dies of, kind of tragically or something. So I thought, oh, that's good, right? So here's the opportunity to have that outreach. But we don't often see that. But for a lot of people, I remember, so Kurt Cobain dies. And then probably early 2000, they released his journals as a book. And it was like, actually, if I recall, there was actual pages photocopied. I happened to be in a Barnes & Noble, and I see this young girl pick it up, and she's reading it, and she's crying. And she's probably crying because she's feeling something that's reflected in his writing. And I would think, this is, and I don't own the book, but I would hope maybe this is an opportunity to have some sort of outreach. But at the time I thought, I don't know if this is really good, because I'm sure what he's writing about is a lot of sadness. And I don't know if that's helpful or hurtful. I didn't know the answer at the time. But I know she didn't look happy or fulfilled. She looked more, and it wasn't this is so tragic. It was bringing up more darkness and sadness for her. So I do think we need a better way to talk about death and to process it. Because in my opinion, here, all too often, a week later, people expect you to be okay. And I think what these practices say is year after year after year, we're not expecting you to be okay. We're expecting you to come, practice as a group, and continue to work on those feelings, and eventually put them in context and see them differently throughout your life. And then that's okay. Right? That's what's supposed to be okay, not that somehow magically it's all done. And having these memorial halls on the same grounds as the meditation hall is a very healthy thing to go in and say, oh, hey mom, up on the shelf, now I'm really seeing things differently and my meditation's going well, and talking and sharing that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a good thing. When I see Japanese Buddhism sort of derided as funeral Buddhism, I'm kind of sad about that, because I think it's missing something. Is there some truth to the criticism? Yeah, there definitely are practitioners who don't understand Buddhism at all, but they're really good at putting on a funeral display, and then that's it. But that's not the end of the story, right? Are there, I grew up sort of Catholic. Were there Catholic priests that just did the mass and then that was it? Yeah, right? We would go to the priest residence and they'd do mass and then sitting around in jeans and just binge watching movies and eating popcorn. And they had a full stock bar and there was no conversation about religion afterwards. Is that the entire breadth and depth of the Catholic Church? No, right? I've also gone to Georgetown and Gonzaga, and you'd see, scholar priests that can explain the Bible and who have, deep, prayer practices of their own. So that's not the whole story, right? No one place is the whole story. But I think on the whole, you do see, this very strong, and it's throughout all of Asia, there will be some concern and connection with death and the deceased, and prayers for the deceased as part of practice. So I will skip down a little bit because we've covered things in the outline already. So Higan, where do we get this word? So being the other shore, it is derived in meaning from the Sanskrit paramita, meaning precepts or perfection. So paramita on one sense are practices you do, like the 6 paramitas. On the other hand, paramita is perfection of the path. And if you've perfected the path, then you're enlightened. So Higan paramita would be this other shore of enlightenment from our world. So when you do any service, no matter what, you come to the temple, you see the paramitas symbolically arranged as physical offerings. So you have dana paramita, giving, generosity, shila paramita, the morality, observing the precepts, kshanti, tolerance, endurance, or forbearance as a practice, vidya, effort or vigor. Vidya actually is the word origin of vigor. Dhyana, meditation, and then prajna, wisdom. So you see these 6 practices as actual practices. So this is, you read the sutra, you see this is what you should do. So you come to the temple and the practice is arranged around doing that, right? You have giving and effort and meditation and wisdom and offerings. And then physically, you see them symbolized in the rituals with offerings of water, powdered incense, stick incense, flowers, food and drink, light in the form of candles, right? You see these things offered. So the water, the idea that it's necessary for life, so it reminds us of giving. Right? So first thing somebody comes to your house, you offer them something to drink, right? This is worldwide culture. Water of some form, coffee, tea, something, there's a beverage. Powdered incense, so we have this. So we don't quite have enough of it here for me to put by the door, but a lot of bigger temples, especially Shingon temples, when you walk in, there's actually this container of zuko, the rubbing incense. And so perfuming the body, representing the precepts, meaning, if you do this, then the body is purified.
See.
Yes, right, Shila Prabhupada. So observing the precepts. So morality is one of them, but also just observing those precepts, and then you're doing this with the body, which also makes sense. If you maintain the precepts or hold the precepts, you're less likely to invite trouble. So the body is maintained, the mind is calm, right? So it's, in a way, it's perfumed. The flowers, you see the sight of the flowers, and you calm the mind. So I got the flowers today at Trader Joe's. Thank you, Trader Joe's. And we have dahlias. And I mentioned earlier, the woman at the checkout was just like captivated, and she said, they're so beautiful. Sometimes you just are captivated by the beauty and you want to stare at them. And then she proceeded to just be captivated by the flowers. So she actually was reminded of the spiritual practice. So she had a mini meditation just looking at the flowers. So I thought we shared a moment before it became too awkward for the person behind me to to go through the line too. The stick incense is effort vidya. So the idea that once you light it, it burns from the top to the bottom at a constant rate until it's completely consumed. So it should symbolize our life also, right? That we work hard throughout life until it's at its end, but it doesn't burn fast and slow and get lazy, and then burn fast again and slow. So it's just a constant, right? We'll offer that stick later. Then food and drink that you feel satiated or fulfilled, and this symbolizing meditation. That if you're in meditation, you are fulfilled by the bliss of the meditation. You're not wanting for anything, right? So you're in a meditative state. So you have everything you need. And then light and candles, it's that illumination in darkness. That's why we have them, symbolizing enlightenment itself or wisdom. So you see these offerings all the time. I was once at a service and somebody refused to offer incense, and I tried to explain, but they viewed it as strictly, somehow you're worshiping the dead, rather than seeing it as you're symbolically offering your effort, right, on their behalf, and it's perfuming the air to remind people of the practice. And so sometimes people get the ideas behind these things wrong or take it in a different way. So it's helpful to remind ourselves for these things. So this is Higan, right? We have these services, people come and make the offerings. It's a group practice. But again, I think from a Western perspective, this is something I wish people would steal and do more. Because I hear, I see it on Facebook. People. I have a classmate who, on a routine basis, her son died, and on a routine basis, she marks, another month without you, and I haven't seen anyone that, not just every year or something, but kind of ongoing basis. So to imagine the kind of hurt and pain that is still there, and probably not having a good outlet for that. So it would be great if we did have it. Same thing, I think when some celebrity, especially if they're young, is found dead, or they're killed in some way, it's not just, in my opinion, it's not just people grieving that actual person, but it's sort of a public opportunity for people to just grieve. But they're often not able to say, I'm actually grieving about mom or dad or grandma or my brother or something. they just come out to grieve. And I think sometimes the world is shocked, like, wow, did that many people really like this singer or that actor? And I think there's a lot of times more behind it, but now we're able to go someplace and light a candle or offer flowers, and there's other people around, and there's no other space in our society for that. So for people to, go, oh, it's funeral Buddhism or it's superstition, I think cheapens this sort of basic, deep human need. And why shouldn't the temple be there to provide an outlet for that and support for that? And in fact, one that's very structured and loving and supportive. Because, like always, afterwards you get to eat together, and then people are smiling. So you cry and then you smile, and then you feel like you reconnect with people and you talk about things, and that's very important. Because I think we have more and more people don't know how to connect with each other, and they're separate, and they're dying for some way to connect. So now it's an app, swiping back and forth, or the only place you can connect with people is over alcohol or something, and then there's no real connection. Or the connection offered in society is you have to sell yourself in some manner. I took a Lyft the other day and I thought, leaving the airport, like, there's all these other Lyft drivers, but we're all driving around in separate cars, leaving the same place, going to different places, and then you get out, and I start to contemplate, like, is the Lyft driver lonely? Will they have meaningful conversation? Will they ever meet these people again? Will true human connection happen, or is it just chit chat, nervous chit chat? So how long have you been driving for Lyft? I'm sure it's the same questions over and over again, right? So we, all of our time is spent selling our efforts to make money, and we can't connect. So in my opinion, I think we need spaces like this. Sadly, we don't have a space we don't have a cathedral with 1,000 seats and 1,000 full seats, but hopefully our audience online is now larger, which makes me happy on one hand, but it's also to some degree sad, because how do you create community, and how do people really heal? How do you practice that way? So that's my overview of Higan.